Good afternoon and welcome. My name is David Sloss. I'm a professor of law at Santa Clara University, and I am hosting this event today. We're going to be talking about a new book that is being published by Oxford University Press. It's available for purchase now on the Oxford University Press website, and everyone who's participating in this webinar should be getting an email afterwards with a flyer that gives you a discount code so that you can get 30% off. So the book is an edited volume. The title is the International Legal Order Unraveling? I had the privilege of being the editor for the book and also the chair of a study group pulled together by the American branch of the International Law Association. The book is really an outgrowth of that study group, and I'm fortunate that I was able to gather together just an absolutely stellar group of scholars to work on this project. I think the book is terrific, largely because I had a terrific group of people contributing to the project, and I'm happy that 4 of them are with me here today to talk about the main themes of the book. So I'm going to do some very brief introductions, and then we'll get on to substance. So joining me today is James T. Gathii. He is a professor of law and the Wing-Tat Lee Chair in International Law at Loyola University Chicago School of Law. Also, Tom Ginsberg, who is the Leo Spitz Professor of International Law at the University of Chicago and a research professor with the American Bar Foundation. Then Jaya Ramji Nagalis, who is the Associate Dean for Research and the I. Herman Stern Research Professor at Temple University's Beasley School of Law. Last but not least, Layla Sadat, who is the James Carr Professor of International Criminal Law at Washington University. She is also the director of the Crimes Against Humanity Initiative and a special advisor to the ICC prosecutor on crimes against humanity. So I'm going to ask a series of questions to the panelists, and we'll hear from all of them on each of these questions. And then we'll also have time at the end for audience Q&A. So members of the audience, if you have questions, you can use the Q&A function to pose questions, and we'll get to as many of them at the end as we can. So let me start first with the question that the book itself poses, which is the international legal order unraveling? For this first round of questions, why don't we start with James, and then we'll hear from others. So James, go ahead, please.
So thanks, David, and for organizing this launch, and also for congratulations for such a timely book and putting us together. The conversations were great. My chapter in this book was co-authored with Sergio Puig, and we focused on international economic law from a global South perspective. And our primary argument is that we pushed back. You know, we did not think that the global order is unraveling. If it's unraveling because its makers are disenchanted with it. But countries of the global South were disenchanted with this order for many decades. And they were always critical because first, they hadn't participated in the making of this global order. Many of them were under colonial rule. Second, many of the rules in this international economic order were unfair, and in their view constituted a racialized global order that put the countries that were former colonies at the very top. So for example, at the Bretton Woods institutions, the economic dominance of the former colonial powers is entrenched in its governance structures through the weighted voting system, in which for example, the US controls 15.9% of the total voting power in the bank, while Chad, one of the poorest countries in the world, only controls 0.07% of the voting power. And as such, and you can go to the IMF as well, the weighted voting system is exactly the same. These two institutions in particular have been really critical in the economic fate of developing countries. So they've been disenchanted for a long time. And in their view, the system unraveled long ago for them. It's not, for them, the unraveling, the news of the unraveling of the global order is not new. And the final thing I just wanted to say is that we have seen previous episodes of the US's disenchantment with this order through US exceptionalism in many areas, arguments about US exceptionalism in many areas, not least of which has been the use of force without the constraints that the US supported after the end of the Second World War. For countries of the global South, their sense was that different principles could undergird the international legal order, and to the extent to which those principles they favored, for example, in Bandung in 1955, are not the underlying principles governing the global order. The disenchantment is a Western disenchantment and not one from the global South.
All right, thanks very much. Leila, let me turn to you next, and I'd like to hear your perspective on this question.
Thank you. And David, thank you so much for convening the study group and chairing all of us and producing this really amazing volume. I was reading your introduction and looking over some of the work that was done. I think if we had had the invasion of Ukraine, well, there had been one prior, there had been the annexation of Crimea, but that really wasn't as much on the radar screen as the current conflict is now. Maybe some of us would tweak our answers a little bit to your questions. Although to James's point, Crimea had already been annexed, and it's not really even there as one of the major issues. China is, but not the Russian Federation. So let me talk a little bit about my chapter, which was international criminal law. And international criminal law is marked with a stable check in the very nice introduction that David did to the book, because it is an area, in some ways, it's actually growing. And I like the distinction that the book makes between a liberal international legal order and a rules-based international legal order, because without stealing any of Tom's thunder, you could have a very authoritarian use of international criminal law. And in fact, what we're seeing is some very interesting trends, which is a increase in transnational criminal law, terrorism treaties, corruption treaties, a proposal now being floated to have a new anti-corruption court to add to the plethora of international courts that we have that are adjudicating international crimes. And so we have, in a sense, more law, more rules, more application, both in national and international systems of many of the crimes that were developed during the period of international criminal law's renaissance in 1991 to 2008. At the same time, we also have a really flagrant use of force ongoing, and a lot of the controversy about the crime of aggression, when it was placed into the Rome Statute, is resurfacing now with interesting calls by the United States, not so much by the US government, by many Americans and UK nationals for prosecutions based on the crime of aggression with respect to Russian aggression, and pushback from the Global South, in the sense that much of the Global South saying, well, wait a minute, when we were trying to negotiate this, it was in fact those same countries who are now hoping to use aggression were pushing against its actual codification. So what I think is really interesting is that the crime that's definitely been slowest to develop in a strong and stable way has been aggression, the crime of aggression, which does have this impact on one of the core values of the international legal system, which is peace. right? The first pillar of the international legal system is the right to live in peace. And that comes through in the book. So I wouldn't say that the system is unraveling, but I would say that the refusal by a certain group of states to take the crime of aggression more seriously during its negotiation in Rome in Kampala in 2010, when they tried to put it in the Rome Statute, and the abuse of the prohibition on the use of force, not just by the Russian Federation, but also, as you point out in the book, in 2003 by the United States and UK. I think that is an area that we have to be really vigilant about, because there are definitely some tendencies of fraying of the system through unlawful uses of force. And this goes to maybe James's point. The United States now, when we started this project, it was during the Trump administration, and the Trump administration was actively attacking the International Criminal Court, sanctioning the prosecutor and one of her deputies, attacking the court both verbally, financially, and in every other way. And that could have really been seen as a huge challenge to the continued work of the court and creation of a rules-based legal order. The current administration supports the court, so that's a real positive. And the Ukraine situation has actually caused a bipartisan reaction in the United States. But I think we could definitely see some backsliding there. So thank you, and sorry for going on too long.
Quite all right. Thank you, Layla. Jaya, let's hear from you next.
So thank you. Thanks so much for organizing the volume and this talk, and looking forward to the conversation. So I guess I kind of fall in James's camp to some extent. If we think of the international legal order as a rules-based order, I'm not really sure it's unraveling in the field of migration law, but that's because there was never a robust legal order to begin with, because migration law has largely deferred to sovereignty and to domestic politics, right? So we see sometimes a politics, but it doesn't necessarily crystallize into binding law, and we see binding law, but it's overcome by politics. So actually your introduction, David, draws three distinctions between a rules-based order and a sovereignty-based order that I thought were helpful. So you talk about the nature of the individual obligations, and the obligations that exist in international migration law are to individuals, so it is rules-based in that sense. But most human movement across borders is barely governed by formal international law, and that's really where the gap is. So we have this very narrow definition of a refugee. We have non-refoulement definitions under the Convention Against Torture. But then we see kind of, and those, right, we've seen pretty remarkably been overcome by politics in recent years. And then we see international human rights law, labor law, law of the sea, and trade law. And those areas of the law just fail to effectively coordinate state behavior around transnational migration. So most labor migrants are excluded because they're undocumented. Migrants needing protection who don't fit into the Refugee Convention or the Convention Against Torture just aren't protected. So it's very deferential to sovereignty. Then you talk secondly about the degree to which states delegate authority to international institutions, and in the migration law space, we of course have the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Organization for Migration. UNHCR really has very limited authority to recognize refugees on its own and to develop legal standards. It can make soft law, it can work with authority delegated by sovereigns on a case-by-case basis, but states can and do pick and choose. And IOM, I'm afraid, is really just largely a shell for the interests of powerful states. So it's not an effective international organization. And then finally, the degree to which rules are enforced. Again, we have very, very limited enforcement authority. And the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, like IOM, is funded by donor states. And so, right, it's a little bit more values and mission driven, but it's really beholden in the end to donor states, and there's no real enforcement mechanism. And so one of my arguments in my chapter is that the international rules-based orders approach to, or I guess I should say failures with respect to global migration, actually set the seeds of the demise, right, of the order itself, where we see free movements of goods, free movement of capital, but not free movement of people. And that's really, we can all see that problem in the front pages of the news every day.
Great, thank you. Tom, let's hear from you.
Great. You know, we completed this very interesting project. It was a joy to work on with all of you and others, but we completed before the Ukraine invasion. And that is obviously, you know, when you think, well, is the international legal order unraveling? That would be, you know, something we'd all think about as being this kind of really important moment. And I actually believe that it shows that the international legal order is not unraveling. And that's because, you know, 141 states, dictatorships and democracies, condemned the invasion in the General Assembly. It's true that the United States was, and you know, the European Union have been leaders there, but there are many other states, including Russia's immediate neighbors, which don't like the idea that, you know, you actually can facially violate Article 2.4 and just take neighbors' sovereign territory. So in some sense, I think that's a kind of very interesting moment in which the international legal order, the core feature, Article 2.4 and the virtue of territorial integrity, which benefits small, weak states as much as big, powerful ones, has been, you know, reinforced. Of course, there are other trends which are cutting in the other directions. I talk in my chapter a lot about, you know, the rise of authoritarian international law and states that want to use the appearance of compliance with international law while undermining, you know, its most beneficial you know, mechanisms. And of course, we saw a lot of this with the Ukraine invasion too. The language that was used by Vladimir Putin, who's of course a lawyer, sounded in self-determination, sounded in genocide. You know, he's using these terms and abusing the terms. But what's interesting is I don't think people really buy that. So I in some sense, as horrible as it is, you know, see in terms of the order as a whole, you know, some recalibration. The future of it, as my chapter argues, is going to be determined largely by relations between the United States and China, both of which have really similar attitudes towards international law. They're both hegemonic. They both don't want to be bound by it. They both see themselves as exceptional. But this means that actually international law's, you know, future depends on all the other powers in a multipolar world. Smaller powers, regional associations. In my latest book, I was writing a lot about James' part of the world, you know, some of the regional associations in Africa. We see also in Latin America that regional associations play a really important role in buttressing democracy and in advancing international law. And that's really interesting to me and gives me a little bit of optimism.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to say a couple of words about this question and then I'll turn it back over to the others. But I will say that when I started on this project a few years ago, I was feeling pretty pessimistic about the future of the international legal order. That was one of the reasons for starting the project. I think over the course of the project, I became less pessimistic and more hopeful. And part of that is because I think the international order is so multifaceted. So the book addresses a range of different topics, including different topics in international economic law, trade law, investment law, anti-corruption law, as well as topics related to use of force, both use ad bellum and use in bello, and a range of topics related to human rights. And I think the picture for me that emerged is a little bit like the parable of the 7 blind men and the elephant, right? What the elephant looked like depends on which part of the elephant you're focusing on. So I think actually lots of pieces of the international order seem to be pretty resilient and in pretty good shape. But, and Jayo referred to this, there, you know, one of the things that the group grappled with as a whole was, do we think about this as a liberal international order or not? And is liberal a good thing or not? There wasn't uniform agreement on that. But I think that the pieces, my own sense is that to the extent that the international order is liberal, it's hard to maintain that on a global basis in light of the rising power of China. We've got powerful illiberal states in both China and Russia who clearly aren't buying into a liberal international order. And so if we want to preserve liberal values in the international order, it's probably going to have to happen on a less than global basis. But we still desperately need global cooperation on a range of issues that are not particularly associated with liberalism, and whether we can get that cooperation to deal with things like climate change and future pandemics, I think is an open question, but we'll have to see what goes. All right. So I also asked everybody to think about what are grounds for optimism about the future of the international order. What's going on that makes you hopeful? Jaya, let me start with you on this one.
So I come down on the not so hopeful side. I'm not the most optimistic because it's been a tough time for international migration law over the past few years with the rise of nationalist populist regimes. So one place where maybe there's a little cause for optimism is we've seen increasing, still too little, but increasing incorporation of climate migration questions into international environmental law. There's a lot more work to be done there. But for example, the platform on disaster displacement includes working with the Global Compact on Migration, and the Sendai framework and the UNFCCC. So there is some incorporation starting to happen. There was also a case that came down the UN Human Rights Committee decided, I think it was last month, Billy versus Australia in a situation, we'd had the Te Tiota case a few years ago in a situation of an island state that was facing rising seawaters, that there was no violation of the right to life. And here similarly, in a similar situation, the court found no violation of the right to life, but the committee, the Human Rights Committee, but there was a violation of the right to family life and the right to minority cultures, right? So there's some also a little bit of movement around that in human rights law. I would, take a page from Tom's book and say we do see optimism in regional development of migration law. I think that's where the really interesting work is happening. There's been interesting developments, right, in Africa and also in South America, right? And so we see. Of course, under Mercosur, nationals of 9 South American countries can reside and work in all other member states, right? That's pretty impressive. And then we see, I think, knock-on benefits of that, because we see the response in Colombia to the movement of Venezuelans. Now, there are a lot of reasons for the generosity of the response, but right, the Mercosur framework sets up this idea that we can provide all comers with temporary residence that can lead to permanent residence, because this is a regional movement, because we have a shared history, because we were once the migrants. And so I think that's a place to look for optimism and maybe to draw lessons about the way other parts of the world can shape migration law. And then both Leila and Tom talked a little bit about Ukraine. And I think in terms of migration, there is some cause for optimism in the response to Ukraine, in that it shows that states, if they want to, can actually cooperate on migration and offer migrants some real autonomy. So the EU's response really was not to go back to Dublin and say, right, you're stuck in the first country you go to. It was to invoke the Temporary Protection Directive and say, you can go wherever you want in Europe. Which was a big change. But I will say that also is a very political response. And if we're looking for a rules-based international order, right, the Temporary Protection Directive has existed in EU law since 2001, and they failed to invoke it for the Syrians and any other movement, for Afghans, right, for any other movement. But in response to the Ukrainians, it gets invoked. And so this to me just shows cause for hope, but also the depoliticization of international refugee policy, and in particular the invidious role of race, right? The role of race is really pretty concerning. Even in the Ukraine example, right, we see graduate students from other parts of the world facing really different standards from Ukrainians. So not the most optimistic, but some cause for optimism.
Tom, you already spoke a little bit about optimism, but what else do you see going on that makes you hopeful about the future?
Yeah, it's funny how one's mood depends on very local events. If the Ukraine war had been gone in a different direction, or if the American election yesterday had not gone in the way it did, my optimism for the future of democracy would be very different. But I do think that what we are seeing is a rejection of the most anti-democratic, president we've had in our country's history. And that's good, because that means that we can play a role in buttressing these regional efforts and other things that defend democracy around the world. So that makes me feel a little bit better. I will say one other thing that generally gives me optimism, which is, we're really lucky because we're professors, so we're dealing with young people, and I just see young people moving really quickly in good ways on some really important issues. Climate change is really important to them, and they're really upset, and they should be. And then other issues of inclusion, I just think about the transformation in the way we think about gender in the last 5 years. It's so fast. And, that tends to give me some optimism in the sense that, I may not always understand what's going on, but at least people are moving in a direction of more equality is important to people. And I think that's good.
Right. Thank you. Layla, let's hear from you next.
Thank you. So a couple things, and to piggyback on what Tom said, civil society is really robust right now, and the global networks that it creates are incredibly impressive. And we're seeing that at COP27. I see it in the ICC negotiations. That is a lot of young people, a lot of people who really care, able to use technology to link, to make progress around the world. The ICC is doing better. The results aren't out, right? We don't have new decisions or judgments that are really giving us on the substantive law, but the pack of dogs sort of nipping at the heels of the court and trying to rip it to shreds have stopped for a while. And that's probably a good thing for an institution that was really struggling for a while, even within constituencies you would think would support it. New substantive law is a super exciting development in my area of the world. The push for ecocide as a new crime. I'm not sure it really belongs at the ICC, but it belongs somewhere, maybe in national systems. A new treaty for the prohibition on nuclear weapons. That's a huge step forward, and getting actually one European state in favor of it is an even bigger step forward. Proposals for new institutions like the new Global Corruption Court. And I'll maybe talk about at the end, both on a plus and a negative, we actually have a breakthrough in the 6th Committee on the new Treaty on Crimes Against Humanity that I've been working on for about 15 years now. And we finally got all the permanent members of the Security Council to sign off on a resolution, moving it from one committee to another committee. But these days, that's forward progress.
All right, thank you. James, what makes you hopeful?
Well, thanks. So I guess there's room for cautious optimism. I'm in particular impressed by the fact that there's some credible leaders that have emerged, like the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, who's been speaking across and sort of championing many of the causes, particularly of the Global South, on sovereign debt, on the climate crisis. She's been very articulate, has inspired very many young people around the world, making the case that the world can be organized on organizing principles beyond markets and liberal democracy, to make sure that the values of human rights and equality and racial justice were at the very center of reforming the way that the world responds to lots of the crises of the moment, including, of course, the pandemic as well. So I think, my first moment of cautious optimism is people like her, who, in my view, have taken over the mantle of sort of thought leadership in how to think differently and organize the world in a way that meets the moment much better than we have in the past. So the second, I agree with everybody, regional developments are really where a lot of hope lies. Like Tom, I've been looking in particular at Africa's international courts. And the example I want to give is how they've helped to beat back the decline in democracy on the continent. And in one particular case, litigated for over 6 years at the East African Court of Justice, trying to reverse President Pierre Nkurunziza's effort to have a third unconstitutional term in office, is really inspiring. So these groups risk their lives. These individuals and groups risk their lives, these Burundians, because filing a case, not just in Burundi, but in an international court, was something that the president, who died while these cases were being litigated, didn't allow, and would pursue anyone that went against him. But they got 2 cases out of the Court of First Instance in the East African Court of Justice, and they got two decisions, all in their favor in the appellate division of the East African Court of Justice. Not an easy feat. And the fact that there are an increasing number of litigants who are jumping out of their domestic legal system to litigate in international courts on key constitutional and other questions that they can't litigate in their home country because it's too risky to do so, shows how determined activism against governments that are rolling back democracy is happening in many places. You could also talk about, in the inter-American system, there are many examples of groups that have sought orders from the Inter-American Court as a result of displacement from their own lands, as a result of environmental pollution and destruction. And all these developments, I think, are really important points of optimism, places where we could look for optimism. And lastly, this hasn't yet happened, but again, as a result of the activism in the African context, the Malabo Protocol, which hopefully will come into effect one of these days, has a provision seeking to establish criminal conduct for multinational corporations. Mm-hmm. And this and many other examples, including the leadership these civil society groups have led on things like illicit financial flows and such, I think are really important places where we can look for some optimism, cautious optimism.
Great, thank you. Well, now I'm feeling like I should have done this the other way around, because my next question was going to ask about what are you concerned about? What are you worried about? But let me just encourage people in the audience to go ahead and submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and then we'll get to your questions in a little bit. But so as I said, my next question really is, what specific developments over the past 10 to 15 years make you worried or concerned about the future of the international legal order? Loyola, let me start with you on this one.
I think I'll just pick 2. I think one of my biggest worries is actually a US-centric worry, which is the difficulty of incorporating international law norms inside the United States legal system. And that's really one that's bedeviling me. It's something we're seeing, these clashes of our constitutional system having some very, very old theories about rights and law and coming into conflict with the international human rights framework. I think of reproductive rights, where there is a human right to reproductive health. There's not one in the United States. I think of gun violence, where there are rights to be safe and a right to life of people and being, which we don't have in our constitutional framework. I think of education. There's no right to education in the United States Constitution. So I could just go on. And we have increasing conservatism, at least in some aspects of the federal judiciary, that is making it harder and harder to have an effective interface. So as all this law is burgeoning outside the United States, the barriers to entry inside the United States, especially for human rights regimes, less so in the commercial area, are growing. And so that worries me, because I don't really know what to do about it. And so far, my efforts to treat it as an education issue have been completely unsuccessful. The other thing is rising authoritarianism. So during the Crimes Against Humanity negotiations, I was just at the UN, and there's this new group that showed up. They have a Wikipedia page, and they call themselves Friends of the United Nations Charter. And it's the Russian Federation, Belarus, Iran, Venezuela, and they are deeply sovereigntist, to use the framing that we have sort of versus rules-based, completely sovereigntist, and they're growing in assertiveness. I can't say they're growing in strength, but to some extent they're growing in numbers, and we have seen some right-wing governments elected around the world, whether it's Italy, Sweden, or Israel, and that worries me as well. We may have defeated Donald Trump elected electorally, but those ideas of nationalism and populism are still out there, and they're increasingly assertive. I don't know if they're increasingly successful.
All right, Tom, let me go to you next on this question.
Yeah, well, it's, I've been writing a little bit about the authoritarian trend, and that is, in fact, the great worrying thing. I don't worry so much about nationalism or populism per se. I think, in some context, populism is a healthy political development, but, it's governing as a populist and an authoritarian that has to be most disconcerting. And the other thing I'd say is the techno-authoritarianism, in particular associated with China. I think that China's international strategy is not to turn the world authoritarian. I don't think they could care less how we govern ourselves. But what they want to ensure is that we aren't doing things to undermine their core interests. So in their ideal world, no one could ever associate Xi Jinping with Winnie the Pooh, which is something that people do to mock him because he kind of looks like him. And they would just have a global mechanism, techno-authoritarianism, that would prevent any of us from ever doing that. And they'd be really happy with that. So that's obviously deeply illiberal. And so the technology combined with the authoritarianism, I think, is really worrying. And I don't think we have a very good solution, just as we don't really have a good solution for the social media. Why people have a lot of proposals, but I don't think we've quite solved that problem, which is deeply, in my view, kind of undermining of democracy.
Thank you. James, what has you most concerned as you're looking to the future of the international legal order?
Yeah, I guess, two big things, two big buckets. One is many countries in the global south are now experiencing multiple crises. The pandemic, the sovereign debt crisis, the climate crisis, lots of poverty still unresolved as a result of many years of structural adjustment, as well as the failures of the countries of the global south to do what they should do. And these legacies, these problems are made worse by the legacies of the past, including the legacies of colonialism. So that's sort of one big bucket of things that are always festering in many places in the global south. The second, to be much, much more specific, is that I worry that some of the efforts at reform of some regimes of international law, like the international investment law regime, are not really dealing with some of the challenges that those systems of international law, that those regimes of international law pose. So, for example, the UNCITRAL Working Group 3 in the international investment law area is working on what I would call surface level reforms that are not looking at the more deeper structural questions that allow that system to allow investors to externalize their massive environmental, human rights, and other costs associated with their operations, or the fact that the system provides an asymmetrical set of rights where investors can sue states and states cannot sue investors. So I remain quite worried that lots of talk about reform are entrenching rather than actually dealing with some of the substantive questions that these regimes pose at the global level.
Thank you. Jaya, let you clean up on this one.
Yeah. Well, pessimism is where I sit, right? So, I think one big concern that relates to the climate chapter is climate migration, and that there's, right, as I was saying, right, if the international rules-based order's failure to regulate migration has set the seeds of its own demise, right? We just don't really have a framework for climate migration, and that's increasingly going to be on the agenda. We're already seeing movement through slow onset climate change that's not being recognized as climate migration. We'll see more and more movement from disasters, and we just need some kind of coordinated response. And it's happening in fits and starts, but it's not what I would call a robust regime, and that's what we're really going to need for what we're going to be facing. soon. You know, another thing that we've seen in the migration space in response to the pandemic is just the breathtaking display of sovereignty in closing borders. I mean, that's really been, you know, a remarkable demonstration of flex of sovereign muscle that is still not gone. Right, once that muscle is flexed, right, the sovereigns aren't really willing, even though, right, that the pandemic is over. Biden has said the pandemic is over. He's still enforcing public health justified laws at the border, right? So those justifications continue, which is concerning in the migration space, and I think, right, has knock-on ramifications elsewhere. You know, the kind of dark side of what I talked about in Ukraine is really just the discrimination and racism that we see ongoing in migration law and policy. So, you know, one contrast that you know, is pretty clear with the Ukrainians is because the U.S. response to the Afghans was happening right at the same time, and right, there's a much clearer link to our responsibility for what happened in Afghanistan, but the response so much less generous in the Ukrainians and even, right, the Southeast Asians and the Kosovars years ago. So, right, it doesn't seem like it's getting better, right? It seems like, in fact, it may be getting worse. And then we can also contrast the European response, as I said before, to the Syrians with the Ukrainians. And, you know, Australia, I don't even know where to start at the time in 3 minutes to talk about Australia, but it's you know, it's rough. So right, in terms of increasing politicization and deference to sovereigns, you know, we're not seeing a robust returns to rules in the migration space, and I think that's a real concern because migration is a normal phenomenon and it's going to continue, and we need an effective response. And again, we don't want it to be continually unregulated by international law. So I'll stop there. And
thank you. Maybe I'll say a couple words here about sort of more on the sort of grounds for optimism, and then we can turn it over to audience questions. So one chapter in the book is about climate change, which I think everybody's worried about. But I will say the woman who wrote that chapter, Maxine Burkett, is now in the Biden administration working on climate issues. And I think that I'm actually in part hopeful because I think Biden administration has brought in a lot of good people. She's one example to help solve some of these problems. So I think we have a much better team working on a range of these issues now under President Biden than we did under President Trump. And I will also mention that one of the other contributing authors to the book was Laura Dickinson. She and I co-authored a piece that is just recently out in the American Journal of International Law that says some of what Tom was referring to earlier about how the response to the Ukraine crisis actually does give some grounds for hope, and that we see a lot of states coming together to push back against Russian aggression in Ukraine. You know, obviously we don't know how that's going to end, but I think that we're seeing some broad-based multilateral cooperation in response to Russian aggression in Ukraine, which I think is a sign of hope. So let me now turn it over to audience questions. And Taylor, why don't you just read out the first question here?
Yeah, so we've gotten a few questions that ask the panelists to consider some of the more recent developments in the world, you know, one of which being the recent midterm elections, and whether you have any ideas as to how those midterm elections might influence the U.S. approach to addressing some of these pertinent international challenges. And relatedly, another development that the panelists might want to look at is kind of building on the topic of the challenge to certain rights, particularly in the US, like women's rights, reproductive rights, and how those challenges could be addressed as well.
All right, who would like to start on this?
I could say
Tom, you want to go first? Go ahead.
Yeah, I did bring it up in the main presentation or main Q&A. So, you know, yeah, I do think elections are complicated and there's lots of messages to take away. But one thing that the talking heads are saying is that, you know, young women in particular, and I see this in my own family, aren't putting up with this kind of stuff and aren't politically mobilized in a way that, they might not have been otherwise. And so, and I think there is a rights-based, kind of discourse around, freedom to control one's body and reproductive choices. And so, I think look, this is what I was saying, like if the election had gone in another direction, it might be a very pessimistic moment, but I do see some optimistic signs. There's also those structural reasons why, I think both Leila and James have referred to the US and I think Jaya too, a US exceptionalism, and, that's going to continue too. So I wouldn't want to say that, we're moving towards a new era of cooperation. I think the Xi Jinping has just been confirmed for his next 5-year term, or he's preparing to take that up in January, and that means that we're now in a period where U.S.-China cooperation is possible again. There was a confrontational stance, obviously, until then, and big lockdowns in China and such that are related to that, tight sense of needing to control. So we may see some breakthrough in terms of the U.S.-China duopoly model, which I talk about in my chapter.
Other thoughts on the midterm elections? Leila, go ahead. Or the equality issue that was raised?
Yeah, I think I'll speak a little bit to the equality issue because I did raise it. It is something that I puzzle over, which is the disconnect between America, which has a very strong legal tradition and rights-based tradition that's increasingly at odds with global trends, even abortion trends. Cuba just legalized abortion, right? So the question is how, I think an interesting question for research is why? Some of it can be traced to the pedigree, the ancient pedigree and the historical circumstances that framed our own constitutional experience. And some of it really is an American exceptionalism and a populism. I'm more worried than Tom about populism. I think the nationalistic fervor that we're the best and you should vote for, that looking internally is a problem, particularly in our country. The Human Rights Committee has said right to reproductive health is a human right, and that you can't protect your right to life, your right to dignity, your right to integrity without reproductive health. That's almost a common sense idea now globally, and it's not yet affecting 40% of the American electorate. And I'm not really sure why that is, but I think that worries me because it's so well established on the international space. That doesn't mean other countries don't prohibit abortion, but the trend has been really the opposite way that the United States has gone.
Yeah, and I guess maybe I'll say, on the migration front, I think certainly if the elections had gone differently, right, we could be in a very different space. But there's a lot that the Biden administration could do with or without Congress, right? The executive has a lot of power on the migration side, and David organized an ASIL Unbound around the Biden administration inauguration, and there was a lot more hope then that the administration would do a lot more, but migration still really seems to be the third rail in politics that no one wants to touch. So, I think there's something that could be done there, but I don't know that the results of the election are going to make things. I mean, I guess they've stopped things from getting really, really bad, but I don't know that they're going to push things forward in a positive direction.
James, anything you want to add on this?
Well, nothing very useful to add to this discussion, except to agree that the Biden administration could have done much, much more to support the women in Iran and elsewhere around the world. We've seen previous US administrations been much, much more vocal and supportive. And this is just another roundabout way of saying, I think while the election was very hopeful for all the reasons everybody has said, the fact that Congress will be very closely divided is going to make it very difficult, I think, to move forward with a lot of resolve to address many of the important questions that the questioner was raising.
And I'll just add that it is worth noting that abortion was on the ballot in a couple of conservative states, and Kentucky voted against restrictions on abortion in a referendum, which was a little bit surprising. Kansas elected a Democratic governor, so there's things happening at the state level that I think show that even in some relatively conservative states, there's pushback on restrictions on women's rights, and so we'll see where it. I'm not sure that's going to spread to Alabama, but it is affecting other states. Taylor, what other questions do you have for us here?
So we have a few questions, and I might kind of bring them together just to see if we can get a discussion going here. So one of which asks, what can the International Legal Order do to better protect civil spaces and human rights defenders in recognition of their critical role they play in upholding and pushing the international legal order forward? Can initiatives like the Esperanza Protocol get us there, or do we need some more structural response? And relatedly, someone also asked about the COP process. Is this an example of the positive development of the international legal order, or is it simply a placeholder for a failing system that can't seem to address the climate crisis in a timely manner?
Thoughts on that? James, can I ask? Oh, sorry, Leila, go ahead. Go ahead.
Can I just say something about the COP, which is, and again, this comes from my own experience for the questioner working in the international criminal justice space. Sometimes the difficulty here is it takes a really long time sometimes to get global consensus, not because of ill will could be there, or bad faith could be there, but because there are 193 countries and it's complicated. And I've seen that over and over again, that in international negotiations, one has to have, the patience of Job in order to get something done, because it takes a really, really long time. Going to one of the questions that talked about the democracy deficit, if you want to get more people involved, you have to socialize ideas, and there has to be time to go back to Capitol and consult governments, et cetera. So I think there are vested interests that are anti-climate change, but there is a real sense of urgency, and I have some hope that they'll really make some progress. I think the current framework is there for them to be able to do so. And I think there is that tension between fulsome participation. It's not really a top-down system. It's a complicated system with states going back to capitals, coming back to negotiations, trying to build consensus. I've seen it done in areas that I've worked in, and I have some hope for the COP negotiations. I don't know, but I think it's complicated, and I think there are a lot of competing norms. I do think there is a real sense of urgency, and I think most states parties, including the very able team led by John Kerry, who's our chief envoy, is there. On the human rights defenders, I'll just say a little thing. It does help to have individuals in governments charged with specific portfolios and sitting as part of the table when issues come up about attacks on journalists, attacks on women, attacks on LGBTQ. Having individuals charged with those portfolios who are really around the table when those issues are coming up will make a big difference. And so I think the Esperanza Protocol could be useful. And I think also the Biden administration, as James said, needs to be a little more forward-leaning on some of these issues. Killing of journalists, killing of human rights defenders, attacks on women. They could really be much more forward-leaning and appoint specific people to those positions. And with a Democratic Senate, get them confirmed if they need to. But even if it's at a lower level, really take a little bit more interest in making sure you have those voices around the table when policy is being formulated.
And I may just add briefly to what Leila was saying about COP27. I mean, it is important to remember that when the UN Charter was negotiated, there were 50 states in the world. We now have 193 states in the world. I can tell you as a former treaty negotiator, and a lot of academic literature supports this, the more states you add to the process, the more the complication and difficulty of reaching agreement sort of increases exponentially. And this is why, from my standpoint, the more we can start looking at doing things on a regional level or a plurilateral basis, I think it's a lot easier to make progress with smaller groups. Obviously, there's some things that we just have to deal with 193 countries. We don't have much choice. And that's going to be slow, and it's going to be frustrating, right? Because things just don't move quickly when you have to work out agreement among that number of countries. But I do think there's lots of opportunities here for even dealing with climate among sort of smaller groups. You can get some things done, and to the extent that we can sort of make progress in regional groupings or plurilateral groupings, I think that's going to help us move forward on a range of problems. And let me invite what others. Jaya, go ahead.
Yeah. So maybe I'll jump in on what Layla said about civil society and human rights defenders. I think it's a really important question because civil society is right. If we don't want the international rules-based order to unravel, civil society is just really key to that. I also think it just looks really different in different places. So if we look at, looking close to the US, if we look at Mexico, that's a different question, that's about supporting the groups, and certainly some of them are going to be unpopular with the government, but really ensuring that the infrastructure is in place, and as Layla says, making sure there are voices at the table that can be heard. Whereas if we look at a country like Nicaragua, that's just much tougher, So what does that mean? It means giving people refugee status. It does mean trying to support people on the ground, but when the government is just really trying to eradicate civil society, I think that's a much harder question. I think another place we should really look is to corporations, So we traditionally kind of turn to states and we turn to state policy, but if we look, for example, at human rights defenders on the environment, there are corporations implicated there, and there are pressure points that we can exercise here in the US and abroad, and trying to get corporations to, many of which have done so, but not all have, trying to get corporations to understand that the role that they can play in putting human rights defenders at risk, and ensuring that they are not making situations worse and maybe actually being supportive. So, I think there are a lot of different ways to go with that. I think the Esperanza Protocol is a good start, but there's a lot more that needs to happen on the ground.
Thanks. We only have a couple minutes left, but let me see if either Tom or James wants to add anything on that last question. All right, Taylor, let's take one more question.
Yeah, so this question Layla sort of touched on, but I think it's an important one, is what role did the debates around the legitimacy of the international legal order play in the development of the book? Could it be that a weakened international legal order is more effective at tackling various global issues? And in particular, addressing a lot of the criticism about that, the deficiency of democracy in the international level and legitimacy in the governance structure.
So we certainly, I will say that in in conversations among the working group that or the task force that was working on this within ABILA, we had a lot of conversations about the legitimacy of the international legal order. I think James in particular spoke up on that in a way that was really very helpful, and forced us to sort of think about this, because we do have a problem that we have an order that was essentially created by the global north without much participation from the global south, and the rules sort of perpetuate that inequality. So that's a problem. So I think that there was this tension in working on the book, in thinking about, and some of this comes out in sort of the interchange between my introductory essay and the essay that James co-authored with, chapter that James co-authored with Sergio Puig. To what extent do we want to try and preserve what's good about the current order? Because there are, I think, some things that are good about it. But to what extent do we want to shake it up? And there's a lot of problems with it. And so we've got this balance of trying to improve it and make it better without sort of destroying what's good and what's there. And I think this will be an ongoing challenge. Anybody want to get a last word on this question before we break?
I might just jump in and say something really quick, which is, if you think about legitimacy, you can look at the legitimacy of, say, a democratic system by looking at the median voter. What does the average person think? That's what democracy does. But another way to look at legitimacy of a democratic system is how well does the least well-off person in the democracy think of the system? And I think that might be a useful frame. It sort of follows, I'm influenced here very much by James and his work, that it might be a useful frame for us to think about. If the international legal order is not serving, the states which are actually literally a threat of disappearing, then we really have to ask what purpose it's really serving.
All right, thank you. I think that may be a good note to end on. So thanks to the audience for joining us. Thanks to all the participants for your contributions, both to the work of the study group and your chapters for the volume. And we will be sending out to everybody who participated a flyer that has a code for being able to get a discount on the book. So hopefully the book will be out and available to everyone very soon, in the next couple of weeks, I expect. All right, thank you all.